Welcome to podcast number 411 of Get Paid for Your Pad. Today, my special guest is Koryn Okey. She is the Vice President of Client Experience at Breezeway. And formerly, she worked for 7 years at FlipKey, which is an OTA that was acquired by TripAdvisor, and she was the director of international accounts. So she has about 13 years of experience in the short-term rental industry, and of course, that means she has a wealth of knowledge that she's going to share today with everyone. So, Koryn, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm super excited.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, let's start with FlipKey because I know that FlipKey even existed before Airbnb existed, didn't it?
It did, yeah. The team started FlipKey in 2006, so about 3 or 4 years before Airbnb sort of hit the ground.
It's interesting, right? Because they started earlier, but if you ask 100 people now what is FlipKey versus what's Airbnb, then probably not a lot of people know what FlipKey is, but they were pretty much doing the same thing as Airbnb.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was an interesting phenomenon because I remember when Airbnb came into the market with the concept of a percentage of booking as the fee to list, and this uproar because at the time FlipKey was actually charging on a pay per lead monetary basis. So people were like, a percentage of my booking. Nowadays that's just totally the norm and accepted. So it's wild to look back and think, wow, we were actually doing this before Airbnb. But yeah, the brand recognition and just the kind of overarching sort of representation of an industry that Airbnb has even taken on is very interesting to see. When you talk to someone, it's like, oh, well, I stayed at an Airbnb, and then you're like, actually, you stayed at a vacation rental or a short-term rental. An Airbnb is just a brand within that industry. So,
when you're saying pay per lead, like what does that mean exactly?
So at FlipKey, when you listed on the site, people could inquire about your homes. And when they inquired, if it was an email or a phone call, you were paying a flat rate for each of those. So whether they booked or not, you were paying for that. One of the benefits of that, of course, was that you had the contact information of the guest. You could remarket to them. Perhaps they would book with you in the future. You could, communicate with them directly. And it was just that flat kind of access rate. Whereas then, of course, Airbnb is you're only getting charged for those confirmed bookings, but it's certainly larger as a percentage of the revenue.
Got it. So with FlipKey, you're paying for the lead, where Airbnb keeps the lead, owns the lead until the booking is actually made and the guest, stays at your property, and then you can get the contact information and all of that.
Right, of course, yeah. And it was interesting because when we were doing that pay per lead model initially, there was a sort of a, well, I'm paying for these people that may or may not actually become guests. But still, I think when you look at the economics of it, if we were to look back then of how many of those people actually booked, and had we been taking a percentage, what that would have looked like versus the flat fee. And then, as I said, the ability to remarket to them and whatnot. I think that it certainly was a probably more economical option for folks at that time. And I don't know how many times I've had people say, man, I wish that we were just paying per lead now and not on a percentage of booking. But, the industry has definitely evolved in that way.
Yeah, and I guess if you're paying per lead, that really incentivizes the host to improve their listing and improve their marketing and communication and all of that, because then it's like, oh, I got to convert as many leads as possible to keep my costs down.
Exactly. Yeah. And, it was something that we worked with folks at the time on, is how do you really make sure that your property listing that is being, presented to these travelers is really representative of the property that you're offering them, right? Like, there were some beautiful homes that would have property names of like 1, 2, 3, 4 ST, and And we worked a lot with folks to say, hey, use those adjectives and those descriptions that actually are going to draw people in to make them want to stay with them. So that was part of the service that we did offer, was making sure that folks were best represented to be in front of travelers so that they could leverage and really turn over those inquiries they were getting.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because what I see a lot on Airbnb is, because it's free to list, and you're not paying for anything until you actually get a booking. I see a lot of people that try Airbnb for the first time, and they just create a listing. They don't really spend a lot of time on it, so it's not really converting. But if they would have to pay for each person that would actually view the listing, if they would have to pay for a lead, then they would probably pay more attention to really optimizing that listing.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I also think that if you're just throwing you're throwing a listing up on Airbnb and maybe you put 2 or 3 pictures and where it is, you have to think about who you're competing with, right? And you're competing with people who may have spent hours building their listing and making sure that everything is meticulously accurate, and that all of the amenities are being presented to those potential travelers. And so, a lot of times, and this isn't relevant to just a FlipKey or an Airbnb, but a lot of times people will try some sort of a listing site and say, well, it didn't work for me. And I think that if we really look at it and we say, well, okay, how much inventory is in your market, and how many other homes were you competing with? And, did your listing actually stack up? And was it equal to what the consumer was looking at as alternative options? And, where did your pricing fall into that? Like, there's a lot of things that, a lot of factors at play. And I think that, often it's like, well, it didn't work for me. And, one of the things I always used to ask was like, well, did it not work for you, or did you not work it for you? Right? Because just putting it up there doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're going to be inundated with people who want to stay there. If you don't put the time and energy into making it work. So.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I remember when I first started in 2012, a lot of my friends, they saw how much money I was making with the listing, and they said, hey, I'm gonna do the same. I'm gonna put my house on Airbnb. And then they would contact me a few weeks later and be like, well, Airbnb doesn't work in my market because I don't get any bookings. And then I would look at their listing and I'd be like, well, the way you built your listing is I wouldn't book your listing either.
Right.
They would just spend like 15 minutes, put a couple photos and that's it.
It's wild too. I think, when you're thinking about that and building out your listing, like, I always encourage people, run it past some of your friends, run it past some people that you don't know really well, that will give you a more honest feedback, because, or will give you more honest feedback, because I think that, like, sometimes we're so in the weeds on things that we think everything looks great, but other people come in with a fresh eye, and as a consumer, right, or as a potential traveler, ask them to look at the other homes in your area, and then look at your listing, and then kind of get an honest opinion on, hey, would you book this, or what would you book about something else? So it's crazy though, because I think you're right. It's so easy to put the listing up there. It's everything that happens after the listing is up and you start to get the inquiries that makes this industry so challenging.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because that's the question I always ask my students as well, is when they tell me they don't get enough bookings, I always say the same thing. I'm like, all right, pretend you're a guest and you're staying in your own neighborhood. Go on Airbnb, and which listing would you book? And if it's not yours, then ask yourself, well, why didn't you book yours? What's better about that other listing, right? And that's how you can start kind of, peeling the onion and figuring out, like, what do I need to improve, or what's the real, like, drivers to the decision that you're making on Airbnb, and that can really clarify a lot of things, that process.
Yeah. Well, and I think that lead photo is so important when you're making those listings, right? Like, knowing where your market is and what people are coming there for. A lot of people will put the interior shot, but if I'm going to a home in California and that has in a nice, warm, sunny area, I want that outdoor pool shot so I can envision myself there. And that was always something that we talked a lot about people, was like really selecting the right lead photo, because again, that has to compete in that list of other homes.
Yeah, and it's interesting to look at the search results too and see how your featured image looks compared to the other ones,
Right.
Because if everybody has a picture of the pool, then you might want to put a different picture, right? Because then it stands out more. Because
Yeah,
that's kind of the first thing. Like your listing can get booked if people don't look at your little snippet in the search results.
Right. They've got to click into the listing to book it.
Exactly.
You got to get it in there.
Yeah. I always think if you have something that has like a super bright color, whatever it is, I always think that might be a good featured image, just because your eyes are immediately going there. If there's like everything is blue and green and trees and water, and then suddenly there's this like pink thing, right? It could just be like a painting or something, whatever, couch.
Yeah, it's funny. I just got back from a vacation rental this past weekend, and there were two shots, I think, when I was looking at that listing that really drew me to it. One of them was the outdoor pool area, and the other was the rooftop where you could see the sunset. And I think it's, again, putting yourself in the mindset of that prospective traveler to say what could potentially entice them to want to stay here. And I think totally agree with you on how do you differentiate yourself, right? If everyone has a pool, then like you can still have a pool, but like make it a cooler shot or a way that might differentiate it from all the other pools in the list.
I want to go back to FlipKey for a second, because one question that comes to my mind is FlipKey started before Airbnb. What made Airbnb so successful versus FlipKey? What was the most important thing, the difference between those two platforms?
I think it's really, I can't say for certain. I think obviously if you could have said for certain, that may not have always been the case. But I think one thing that was really different between sort of where Airbnb chose to initially focus versus like a site like what we did with FlipKey, which is FlipKey went with some of the more traditional vacation rental markets. And I think it was at a really big inflection point in the industry. As you think back to 20 years ago in travel, right? Many viewed the vacation rental industry as more of a cottage industry, and it wasn't as sort of sophisticated as it is now. And so when we started FlipKey, we really started working with a lot of those traditional rental markets, the Outer Bankses, the Panhandles, the Breckenridges, et cetera. And I think one thing that Airbnb did that was different was really focusing on a lot of the urban markets. And so I think that by doing that, they were potentially, I guess, able to capture a little bit of a different traveler market as well, right? Because they were able to find folks who were interested in going to those urban markets. And now, if you look at Airbnb, it's certainly a much larger range of inventory that they have on their site. But I think that was probably the biggest thing that was different, was that they really chose to focus on that urban market, whereas FlipKey chose to really focus a little bit more on the same markets as like a VRBO or a HomeAway were focused on, which was more of the traditional market. So I think that was probably it. And I also think that timing, right? Like, when Airbnb came in, the shift was we were sort of right at that inflection point, and Airbnb was able to really build a very strong brand for themselves, right? That Airbnb brand that we talked about earlier. So I think those were probably two things that were a little different. And, they certainly got a bigger splash in like the media and things like that. So I don't think it was that, and I think they were just at different times, sort of with a different focus. And, I'm sure if you talk to, Jeremy, who is the founder of Breezeway, but was also one of the founders of FlipKey, or Brian Chesky, or Brian Sharples, or whomever it may be, they probably have a very different view on that. But that's probably where I see what that biggest difference being.
Yeah, I think another factor, in my opinion, is probably the fact that 2 out of the 3 founders were focused on design. Like they were both, I think they studied industrial engineering or something. They had a mind for design, right? And I remember when I first looked at Airbnb, because I looked at other sites too, and how Airbnb got me as a host was I looked at the site and I was like, oh, this looks really good and it's really user friendly. You know what I mean? Like if
Yeah.
you back then and now, websites look a lot better now, right? But like in 2008, if you look at some old websites, and there's a funny tool for that. I can't remember the name now, but there's a website where you can look at websites in the past.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And
Oh, that's
so
cool.
yeah, so you can look at Airbnb in 2008 and 2009 too. And I mean, if you look at it now, it looks pretty bad, because we're so used to like having nicely designed websites. But back then it was, it actually looked really good compared to most other websites.
Right. Yeah. No, that's definitely true. And I also think that like, them coming in and it was just this new phenomenon. And I think we saw a lot from some of the more traditional markets, a lot of pushback on, well, Airbnb isn't the type of guest that I want, right? That isn't, maybe that's not exactly what they would say they said now, but that was sort of the influx. And I think a lot of people have come full circle to, I think Airbnb attracted a more, a younger audience and as well of travelers. And a lot of folks in those traditional markets sort of said like, well, our folks have been coming to the Outer Banks for 10 years and they're not going to Airbnb. And so I think I think you're right. I think the design of it had a big part in once you got onto the site wanting to use it.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Let's talk quickly about Breezeway. Now, of course, Jeremy's been on the podcast, but for the listeners who don't know what Breezeway is actually one of the technology partners that we have in the Legends X program. And it's been awesome working with you guys. I love the product. A lot of our students love it. And but yeah, give us a quick overview of what is Breezeway.
Yeah, of course. Well, firstly, we are so appreciative of being part of the Legend X program. So we're psyched to have that partnership with you guys. But for folks who aren't familiar with Breezeway, we are an operations and guest services platform. So essentially, our clients are using Breezeway to coordinate their housekeeping, their maintenance, their inspections, to make sure that the home is ready and ready for that next guest. So that term "ready for the next guest," right, can mean a lot of things. It can mean that it's clean, it's been cleaned and it's well prepared. It also can mean that it's really functional, and also that it's safe, and that a lot of folks have taken advantage of our short-term rental safety inspection course that my colleague Justin leads, and really going through and making sure that the homes that they're renting to guests are actually ready for them and they create a safe environment. But yeah, we're working with a ton of folks to help make sure that their operations are just streamlined. It's such a complex piece of the business. So in addition to our operations product, we also have a guest messaging product as well, that allows our clients to communicate with their guests pre and post stay, as well as offer things like extensions on their stay, or the ability to check out, if a guest to check out early, and then communicate that to the housekeeper or whomever is scheduled to go in there to really take advantage on turnover days of that extra time.
Yeah, and one thing that I always think is really interesting is, and we talked about this before we started recording, is when you kind of look at the journey of a typical short-term rental host, not the traditional people that we talked about, but kind of the people who started after Airbnb came on the scene, and it became like a hot topic and more people started hearing about it. People generally, they start with one unit, right? It's either their own home, it's either a room, or maybe it's a vacation home that they have. And, and they do everything themselves, of course.
Yeah.
And, and they see the success, they see the potential. And then they talk to their friends about it. And then, someone will say like, hey, I've got a home. Can you like put that on Airbnb for me as well? Because it seems like, you're doing a good job at it. And then, people start organically adding some more units, and now it turns into a full-time job. And then most people will turn into what we call the hectic host, where at some point it becomes too much, to do everything, operate from memory and do everything by yourself. And then people start, looking at, okay, how do I, use technology to work more efficiently, right? Use tools like Breezeway and use like pricing algorithms and, PMS. And then people start, thinking about, okay, I need systems and I need to hire people in order to grow. So my question is, at what point in that journey, like at how many units, do you see that a tool like Breezeway, where you can manage your maintenance staff and your cleaners, at what point does it become really, really essential, to use technology like that in order to scale your business further?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question. And I think that we could, argue that at one property, it can become necessary. And now I think, if you live on property or you live down the street or around the corner, that's probably not the case, right? But if you live an hour away or you live 5 hours away or in a different state, at one property, it could be necessary, to have these tools. And I also think that, it also is really dependent on what you plan to do, because there are absolutely folks who say, I have this second home and I want to rent it, and it's just going to be like a hobby, right? It's just going to be something that I'm doing, it's not my business, right? I have my full-time job. And so for those folks, with one property who live in the same town, sure, maybe they don't need to invest in a technology stack. But for people who say, okay, I have this home right now, and I'm going to get started with this and I plan to grow, I think that there's an argument that that's where you want to take the time, not only to get that rental up and running, but to make sure that you've got the right tools in place so that you can scale, because inevitably you will get that person who says, hey, can you also manage my property? And it's not at that point that you want to say, oh, I can't right now because I have to get all of my ducks in a row to make sure that I can do it successfully, right? So I think that there is an argument that at one property, this can be this can be very, very valuable for you. I also think that in some instances, again, if you do live right there and you are there, it may not be until you get to 3 or 4 homes where you really start to feel that pain. But again, I think it's the idea, none of us would go into, the idea of being a baker, right, without investing in the right, tools or appliances to be able to help us successfully do that. And so I think that as you start to look at this, if it is something that you're planning to do and potentially grow, making those decisions early on will really benefit you.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. If I would answer this question from what I see is, I think somewhere between 5 to 10 units, it becomes, and depending on your markets, right? And depending if you live close and how you set up your business, somewhere between 5 and 10, it becomes kind of crucial. It becomes essential. Like,
absolutely.
I see very few hosts who don't use the technology once they go above 10 units, or there's exceptions, of course, but it becomes really difficult to manage. The amount of efficiency gains that you can get by using the tools once you're above 10, I think are insane, right? The efficiency gains like way outweigh the cost of the technology. But you make a good point where it's like, well, because the problem, what I see a lot is, if you have 10 units and now you want to implement all this technology, the challenge that you're having then is you don't really have time, number one, right? So you really have time because it takes time to implement these tools and to understand them. There's a learning curve, all of that.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so if you're, like you said, if you're planning to scale and to grow in the future, the best time to implement technology is really like as soon as possible, because now if you have 1 or 2 units, you still have the time. You can do the research, you can sign up for the tools and start learning about it. And then it's just much easier to implement when you don't have 10 units and you don't have any time to focus on it. So yeah, I agree. I think, if you have that vision of really wanting to grow, you might as well just get it as soon as possible.
Well, and I think the other thing on that too, right, is that like, if you have the tools when you start on the right foot. If you don't have the tools, a lot of times people are sort of forced to create these these workarounds, or, oh, I do it this way, but like, I know that's not how I want to do it, but that's how I'm going to do it because that's all I can do right now. And I get, right, there are costs associated with all of these tools, right? It's not like you can just add them and then not have to, offset those costs. But I think that, understanding and setting up your best practices from the beginning are really crucial to that growth opportunity. And so it sounds silly to say like, oh, at 2 properties, you might need these, but I think that like you could go from 2 to 5 really quickly. And if you're trying to do all of these things in memory, things will inevitably get lost. And that's probably the biggest thing. And you nailed it. You hit the nail on the head when you said the efficiency gains. It's also like the mistakes and the missed opportunities or the missteps that you can avoid by having technology.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, before we wrap up this podcast, I would love to know, since you have 13 years of experience in the short-term rental industry, if you worked with hundreds of thousands of hosts, from your perspective, like what are the 3 things that successful hosts do, specifically hosts who manage to scale their business to like 10, 20, 30 units? What are the 3 things that you see?
Well, I think we just touched on one of them, right? Which was the investment in technology and the investment to scale your business successfully. I think that's really important. Again, if you have the one home and you want to, just want to keep your family home and you're not planning to really rent it out or do anything with that, like you don't need to necessarily do that. But I think, the first piece of advice that I would say is, make sure that you're setting yourself up to be successful with the tools that you're using. I also think, one of my favorite parts about the short-term rental industry is the community that exists and the ability and willingness of people to be collaborative and helpful and share things that have worked or that have not worked. So I think, building a community and making sure that you're asking questions and that you're, getting the opportunity to learn from folks who have maybe walked in the path before you is really, really important. So through the Legends X program, through conferences, through, Facebook groups and even, just being involved on blogs and listening to podcasts like this, right? You're learning from other people, even if you're not having direct one-on-one conversations. But I would definitely encourage folks to build a community because you're going to be able to share your challenges, but also share your successes, which I think are more important and are what drive us in this industry to continue to want to do it and excel within it. And then the last one I think is be present, right? If you live in a community that your rental property is in, it's really easy to understand what's going on, but there's a lot of regulation right now that we're seeing in the short-term space. So keep apprised of what's going on, make sure that you're a good neighbor, make sure that you've got all of your taxes and everything in a row to make sure that you're successful and there aren't any issues, because I think that collectively as an industry, we have this really great voice. And you want to be able to be a part of that and make sure that you're doing everything you can to make that property rentable and allowing for it to be rented in your particular destination.
Awesome. That's great advice. So to summarize, number 1 is make sure you really build that foundation. If you want to grow in the future, get your tools, your systems in place. Number 2, be part of the community, learn from others. Don't try to figure everything out by yourself. And number 3, understand what's happening in the industry, right? When it comes to regulations, market trends, all of that stuff. Great advice. Great advice. Awesome. So before we jump off, if people want to learn more about Breezeway, where should they go?
You can visit our website at breezeway.io. We have a ton of information there. There's a lot of case studies. There's also a lot of great content that our team has put together to help folks really be successful, whether they're utilizing Breezeway's tool or not. So yeah, you can visit us at breezeway.io. You can also email VIP@breezeway.io, and we'll get you in touch with someone on our sales team.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Koryn, for being on the show. It was a pleasure to have you.
Me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I look forward to working more with you guys in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks for listening, everybody. And we'll be back with the next episode soon. Take care.